For those of you looking for some old school action, Robotron 64 might be up your alley. An updated version of the classic arcade shooter Robotron 2084, this Nintendo 64 title sets out to emulate the same old school feel as the original in a more modern, at least at the time, package. I picked this up back in early 1998 after reading a couple of reviews of the game, and it sounded pretty cool at the time, but you know, after playing for a bit, I was initially put off and really didn't care for it. Actually, I eventually traded it to a friend for another game, which actually happened to be Link to the Past. But now, nearly 20 years later, I decided to give the game another go to see if it would click. So, just how does this game fare all these years later? Danny from the Famicast here, and this is a retro review for Robotron 64 on the Nintendo 64. Each stage in Robotron 64 is like a mini arena, and they're all filled with different enemies that you'll need to destroy. Once you clear out all the enemies, you can move on to the next level. Waves of enemies warp in as you play. The enemy types here actually quite vary too, with grunts, flying grunts, these big brain guys, tanks, UFOs, insects, and more. And the longer you stay alive, the faster the enemies will move. Not only that, but some of the enemies also shoot projectiles, so you'll have to constantly be on your toes. Having arcade roots, Robotron 64 is a high score-based game. Obviously, you get points from taking out enemies. You can also nab some points by rescuing humans that are wandering around these pretty dangerous stages. Power-ups are also available randomly that give you extra firepower, shields, and you can even find some warps to help you jump to further levels. There's a total of 200 levels to play here too. Controller pack saves and a password system are supported, so you'll be able to pick up where you left off at any time. The controls in Robotron 64 are pretty interesting. So the original arcade game relied on this dual stick setup that allowed players to control the character with one stick and to shoot with the other. So pretty standard stuff that you see nowadays quite often. With the Nintendo 64 lacking a second analog stick, the shooting is actually handled with the C buttons. Of course you can shoot up, down, left, and right, but you can also shoot at diagonals by pressing two buttons at once. Oddly enough, there is actually an option here to use a dual analog setup with two controllers. That's pretty easy to do too. All you have to do is just plug in a controller into the second controller port, and then boom, you can kind of just have at it. I spent the majority of my time playing the game with one controller, but I will say that the two controller setup actually worked quite nicely. In terms of visuals, Robotron 64 isn't really much of a looker, even for the time it's released back in January 98. The game does feature full 3D models, but they are definitely pretty low poly. However, this seems to be somewhat of an intentional move. Now, because of this, the game runs at an extremely smooth frame rate, pretty much never skipping a beat. Now, this is pretty important too, especially when you have dozens and dozens of enemies on screen at the same time, trying to tear you apart. The music here too is also absolutely fantastic. While there aren't really too many tracks, what's on offer here actually fits perfectly with the aesthetic of the game. The variety of techno beats will stick with you well after you put down the controller. While Robotron 64 never saw an official release in Japan, it is interesting to note that the game did see a release here on the PlayStation. Now, if you didn't know, Robotron 64 is actually a port of the PlayStation version of the game titled Robotron X, which was released in 1996. Publishing duties in Japan were handled by a company called SoftBank. I'm pretty sure there's no relation to the Japanese mobile carrier there, but who knows? I don't think so though. Now, these guys were responsible for publishing tons of games on the MSX back in the 80s, and other more modern Western classics in Japan, such as Doom and Area 51 on the PlayStation and Sega Saturn. Robotron 64 is a game I really didn't care for back when it was released. But fast forward nearly 2 decades later, and I found myself really enjoying my time with the game. It's not much of a looker, but what is on offer here is a lot of arcade fun dispersed into short bursts. It's totally worth checking out if you're looking for some fast-paced, old-school action. As always, thank you for checking out this video. If you like what you see, please feel free to give us a like. If you're new to the channel, please feel free to subscribe. We have tons of podcasts, video reviews, special videos, and a whole lot more. Again, this is Danny from the Famicast. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you later.